He threw her out into the freezing cold, pregnant. But what she did next, no one was prepared for. When I first saw her curled up on that frozen porch, my breath caught in my throat because I realized she was still waiting for him. The January wind howled like a restless spirit, and each gust felt like a slap against my face. Icicles hung from the eaves like shattered glass, and her fur was dusted white with frost. I'd heard the neighbor had chased her away just days before, but I never expected to find her lingering at the same doorstep. Her ribs pressed against the rough boards, and every shallow breath she took sent tiny clouds into the air. My heart froze that moment. I locked eyes with her. Those dark pools of sorrow looked right through me, as if she recognized some sorrow in my own soul. Around us, the world was a silent white wasteland, but in her gaze I heard a plea louder than any howl of the wind. I hesitated, torn between stepping closer and fleeing from the raw grief in her eyes. The snow beneath my boots crunched with an accusing finality. Here she was, abandoned and still faithful. My fingers went numb as I reached out, but I stopped, afraid she might bolt or lunge. Instead, she pressed a paw against the porch step, urging someone, anyone, to come back. I remembered the neighbor's words, cold as the morning air. She's nothing but a stray now. Let her fend for herself. I thought at the time he meant it as kindness, that he believed she'd find a new home or wander off into the woods. But as I watched her wait, I realized his cruelty ran deeper than I'd imagined. The wind shifted. Snow swirled in dizzying spirals around us, transforming the yard into a ghostly dance. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She simply stared, steadfast. It looked almost defiant, like she refused to accept that she no longer belonged there. My chest tightened at her resolve. I wanted to call out, to tell her she was safe now, that I would help her. But the words froze on my tongue. Instead, I knelt and studied her face. There was a gentle intelligence in her expression, a calm that seemed almost holy. I felt a pang of shame, realizing I had judged her owner too harshly for his harshness, without knowing the depth of her loyalty. A single tear slid down my cheek as the wind threatened to freeze it solid. She watched it fall, tilting her head with soft curiosity. In that moment, I sensed something impossible. She understood my sorrow. She knew my silent promise to keep her safe. My pulse thundered so loudly, I was sure she could hear it. I remembered thinking how easy it would have been for her to vanish into the woods, to follow her instincts and find another shelter. Yet here she remained, bloodied paws pressed to wood that belonged to someone who had thrown her out. Why? What bond kept her tethered to that cruel threshold? My heart ached with questions I couldn't answer. I glanced at the neighbor's window, dark, empty. His hearth probably glowed with warmth inside, the sound of his footsteps muffled by walls. She could have gone there, but she chose not to. She chose this frozen loneliness, trusting he might return, hope shimmering in her soul like an ember refusing to die. I caught myself hoping he'd come back too, as if redemption belonged only to him. But then I realized the real miracle was here, in this patient creature who still believed in kindness from the cruel. My knees pressed into the icy ground, and I felt smaller than I'd ever been. "Come here, girl," I whispered, voice cracking. But she didn't budge. Her loyalty held her fast. I swallowed hard, chest tight with emotions I could scarcely name. Sorrow, wonder, fear, awe. Her gaze held mine as though she trusted me to understand her story without a single word. I thought I'd seen loyalty in the hunters I once knew, in the bonds between men and their hounds. But this was different. This was something sacred, raw, an unspoken promise of forgiveness. And in that promise, I felt something shift inside me. Shadows stretched across the yard as afternoon surrendered to an early dusk. The cold deepened, biting at my ears and fingers, Yet I stayed rooted, entranced by her silent vigil. I felt tears freeze on my lashes, but I did not blink, unwilling to break the fragile connection forming between us. "I thought you'd just wander off," I said aloud, voice echoing on the wind. "I thought you'd leave and be gone, and that would be the end." She inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring, as if surprised I could read her mind. Then she let out a low breath, half sigh, half plea. My heart pounded in my chest, mind racing with what I should do next. But before I could move, a flake of snow landed on her muzzle, melting instantly into a glistening droplet. She lifted her head and gave me a look that shattered whatever I thought I knew about animals and their hearts. I wanted to stay, to watch her until the stars came out, but the cold began to seep into my bones. Reluctantly, I stood, staring down at her. Her tail twitched once, then settled. The promise in her eyes was clear. She would wait. I turned away, every step an agony, my chest tight with the weight of her trust. She did not move. I glanced back once more to see her silhouette framed by snow-dusted boards, still unwavering, still hopeful. But then I shook my head. I thought that was all there was to it. She was just a dog, waiting for a master who would never return. My boots crunched over the ice as I walked back home into my own warm darkness, turning the moment over in my mind. I told myself she would leave, find food, find shelter. I convinced myself the scene would haunt me for a moment, and then fade away, like the last gasp of a dying winter breeze. But back then, I did not yet know why she was waiting. That evening, when the sun dipped below the pines and the world turned a bruised purple, I saw her rise from the porch with that same slow, deliberate pace. My breath curled in the cold air as I watched her tail tuck low, then lift stiffly as she trotted toward the tree line. I thought it was just another wander, just a dog seeking scraps under the stars. I followed at a distance, boots crunching in the half-frozen grass. The forest smelled of damp pine needles and last year's leaves. She slipped between two birches and disappeared. For a long moment, I thought I'd lost her. Then I caught the faint rustle of fabric. There, beneath a leaning log, was a nest of matted cloth and straw, and tiny, shivering bodies nestled inside. My heart slammed against my ribs. 4 pups, no bigger than fist-sized stones, whined softly. Their coats were as ragged as their mothers, flecked with grime and frost. She stood sentinel at the edge of their den, eyes never leaving me. My fingers convulsed in the jacket pocket where I'd stuffed my gloves. I crept forward, and she didn't growl or bare her teeth. Instead, she dipped her head, as if to say, "They're mine. Keep your distance." Then, without a sound, she turned and vanished deeper into the woods. I waited, shivering, until the sky bruised fully into night. When I heard her whistle soft footsteps again, she had a gift, a fat rabbit, its fur still warm with life. For a moment I thought, she's hunting for the sheer thrill, until I saw her lay the carcass beside her pups, gently tugging at the cloth to arrange it like a mother tucking in children. I knelt, breath clouding around my face, and felt tears sting my eyes. This couldn't be instinct alone. It felt sacred. I wrote it off as nature's mechanics at first, but each night, without fail, she repeated the journey. One evening it was a bit of stale bread left on someone's porch. Another time, a scorched scrap of meat from a campfire pit. Each gift she carried carefully, as though she understood they were tokens of survival. And then, the real shock came. One morning, I saw her stagger back toward the village at dawn, pelvis bleeding, fur matted with brambles. She slowed at my gate, head drooping, but her eyes burned bright with purpose. She'd gotten stuck, I realized. The pups would have starved if she hadn't risked everything to feed them. I pressed my hand against the cold glass of my window and watched her lower the tiny bundle of cloth in front of my door, then limp away without looking back. My heart twisted so fiercely I felt I might pass out. I thought that was where the story ended, but nature had another plan. That very night, as a blizzard roared in, I slipped outside with a flashlight. Soft whimpers led me to the den. By then, the pups were huddled together for warmth, crying for their mother. I reached down, and they nuzzled my glove finger, cold little hearts beating against my palm. Behind me, a shadow slid from the trees. She emerged, claws crunching on the ice, and stopped 2 yards away. Our eyes met, and I swear I heard gratitude in her panting. She sat on her haunches, fur coated with snow, and let out a low, quivering sigh, half relief, half prayer. My mind reeled. Here was this abandoned dog, risking injury and starvation, returning night after night through biting cold just to keep her litter alive, and still she came back to that porch as if she believed someone would open the door. I dropped to my knees, the wind clawing at my jacket, and held out a piece of jerky I'd taken from the house. She took it gently between her teeth, then sat back and stared at me as though she recognized something in my own hungry eyes. I thought it was simple instinct driving her, but she carried it out with some sacred faith I can't explain. That night, I realized I was no longer a mere observer. I had become part of her story, bound by the same unspoken promise to protect those who depend on you, no matter the cost. And in the echo of her paw steps fading into the storm, I understood that real devotion isn't born of guarantee or reward. It's forged in the fierce will to keep faith alive, even when everyone else has given up. That afternoon, the sky was a bruised slate, and the air held a rumor of more snow to come. I'd been inside, thumbing through an old hunting magazine, when I heard a soft scraping at the door. My heart stuttered. Something made me think it was her. I crept to the window and saw, to my shock, a crust of torn bread laid carefully against the threshold. I pressed my forehead to the glass, breath fogging the pain, wondering why she would offer such a gift to the man who'd thrown her out. I slipped on my boots and opened the door, the hinges groaning in protest. Flakes drifted down as I stooped to pick up the bread, stale, half frozen, but placed with solemn intention. My fingers trembled as I traced the ragged edges. I thought this was her way of begging forgiveness for something she didn't understand, or perhaps a peace offering, even though he'd been anything but peaceful. She looked him in the eyes, and there was no hatred, only a plea to stay by her side. The words echoed in my mind like a benediction. I waited, shivering, for her to emerge from the tree line. When she appeared, her coat was streaked with mud and blood, but she carried herself with regal dignity. She watched me cradle the bread, tail wagging in small, hesitant pulses. It felt sacrilegious to intervene in her ritual. I wanted to call out, warn her he might hurt her again, but the look in her eyes stopped me. Careful as a monk laying down an offering, she padded forward and settled a few paces away, head bowed until I closed the door behind me. I propped the door ajar and whispered, "Is that enough?" She lifted her gaze to the empty window, as if expecting him to appear any moment. I thought now he would finally accept her. But then I realized acceptance wasn't what she sought. It was something deeper, a need to bridge the chasm of betrayal with an offering of trust. I felt a tear tremble on my cheek as the wind bit through my jacket. That night, under a sliver of moonlight, I followed her again. She did not flinch when I trailed her into the woodlot. I found the nest, a shape half swallowed by snow, and heard a tiny whimper. Before I could step closer, she emerged, gripped something in her jaws. My breath froze in my chest as she laid down a trembling puppy at the nest's edge, nudging it gently into the circle of ragged cloth. Then she looked back toward the house, as if daring someone to claim her child as their own. I knelt beside the den, and the pup nuzzled my glove with starvation in its bones. My throat constricted. This was no longer instinct. It was an act of sacrifice. She offered her own offspring to the very doorstep that had spat her out. The thought made me stagger backward against a pine trunk, heart pounding so fiercely I feared it might burst through my ribs. Snow began to swirl in violent spirals, and she rose, standing tall on a mound of frozen needles. My pulse thundered. I could smell the musky heat of her breath against the frosted air. She turned her head slowly, eyes fixed on the fallen pup against the harsh brightness of the snow. She watched him, protector and betrayer, and in that gaze I saw a depth of forgiveness I'd only ever imagined in fairy tales. I pictured the neighbor opening that door, finding first stale bread, then a helpless pup. Would he soften then? I thought, now he would finally accept her. But I could feel the lie of that hope shattering like thin ice underfoot. He had no inkling of what he'd done, no memory of the bond broken. She, however, remembered everything, the warmth of his hand on her coat, the lull of his voice calling her name, and still she came back with offerings. I stood in the silent forest, wind tugging at my collar, witnessing the unthinkable. Her ribs moved in a slow, determined rise and fall, a metronome of steadfast love. I pressed my palm against the rough bark as if to anchor myself to reality. Under the moon's cold glare, she let out a soft whine, not for fear or hunger, but for recognition, for justice in the court of her own heart. I slipped away before she noticed me, torn between awe and dread. Back at home, I stood by the door long after I'd locked it, imagining footprints leading to the porch, tiny paw prints pressed into the thin dusting of snow. I could almost hear the soft scrape of cloth as she arranged her gifts. My chest ached. I was part witness, part accomplice, unable to save her from her own sacrificial hope. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake thinking of that crust of bread, once worthless, now hallowed by intention, of the pup whose survival came at the cost of motherly pride, and of the neighbor's door, a silent altar to her unbreakable faith. I realized then that I'd been living in a world too small to contain such devotion. She showed me that love is boundless, that forgiveness can be as fierce as vengeance, and that sometimes the greatest gift is the willingness to give what you cannot do without. That night the wind cut through every layer of my clothes like a blade. I heard the sharp crack of the neighbor's door swinging open, then a harsh shout. Seconds later, she bolted from beneath the porch, teeth bared in panic, and he drove her off again with a roar of anger. Her body trembled as she fled into the darkness, and my heart lurched with her. I grabbed a tin bowl and a loaf of stale bread from my kitchen, bundled into my coat, and stepped outside. The moon was a thin smile in the sky. My breath turned to steam as I set the bowl on the frozen ground where she had disappeared. For a long minute, nothing moved. Then, from the tree line, she emerged, ribs sharp beneath matted fur, eyes hollow but unbroken. She approached the bowl like someone approaching a lifeline. I held my breath as she ate, each bite a desperate prayer against the cold. I thought it was over. I thought feeding her once would be enough to break her spirit. But the next morning, I found her curled around her pups in a shallow depression just beyond my fence, body wrapped around them like a living blanket. Her fur was stiff with frost, and every shiver ran through her slender frame. I watched through the window as she pressed her nose against one tiny snout, then the other, drawing their warmth into her own aching body. My chest constricted. There was something more than just maternal instinct in her. I slipped on my boots and crept closer. The pups stirred, little muffled cries in the silence. She lifted her head at my approach, eyes reflecting both fear and fierce trust. My hand hovered over the gate, trembling. I wanted to scoop her inside, to shut out the cruel night, but she stayed immobile, as if guarding something sacred. I unlocked the gate and stepped into the snow, each footfall a confession of my new allegiance. She didn't flinch. Instead, she pressed her body tighter around her litter, and I saw the lines of pain etched into her flanks. I knelt beside them, resting my palm on her back. She exhaled, a soft rasp that sounded like relief. The pups snuggled closer, and for a moment I felt tears freeze on my lashes. My mind raced. The neighbor could return at any moment and chase her off again. But I couldn't bear to leave her out there. I reached for a blanket I'd brought, and she watched as I draped it over her shivering form. She hunched under it, still protecting the pups, tail thumping weakly against the snow. When I offered more bread, she ate without trying to guard it from me. Her ribs moved in a slow, rhythmic rise and fall. I could see the tension in her jaw release, and I realized she was learning to trust me. My heart pounded so loud I was sure she could hear it. Night fell again, and I stayed by the fence until I saw her retreat into the woods. I entered the den, finding the pups huddled and surprisingly warm under the blanket. Their bodies were soft buds of life against the harsh frost. I laid more cloth around them, then backed away. Through the trees, I saw her standing guard, silhouette haloed by the moon. I thought it couldn't get any more miraculous, but as dawn broke, I witnessed her greatest act of devotion yet. A storm rolled in, wind whipping branches against one another. I trudged along the fence line, worrying about her and her babies. Then I saw her step into the open, coat soaked and white with snow, and begin to circle the den in a silent vigil. She lifted her muzzle to the sky and cried out, a sound that tore through my chest. It wasn't a howl of distress, but a call of defiance, an anthem to her stubborn hope. I reached her just as the first gust nearly knocked me off my feet. She turned, breath ragged, and stared at me. In that moment, she wasn't just a dog fighting for her pups. She was a guardian of something primal, a creature carrying the weight of unspeakable love. My throat tightened so fiercely that I could barely stand. "She won't leave," I whispered, though she could already have told me that. That evening the neighbor's door stayed shut. Instead of retreating to her porch, she led her pups into the shelter of my barn. I opened it cautiously, heart hammering. The pups toddled in, tails wagging like fragile banners. She stood at the threshold, shivering, but upright. I closed the door behind her and turned the heater on, feeling the roar of warm air like redemption. She watched me light the lamp, then laid her head on my boot. I knelt and ran my fingers through her frost-kissed fur. She leaned into my touch, eyes half-lidded in exhaustion and trust. I thought of every moment I'd witnessed, her nightly journeys, her sacrificial offerings, her unwavering faith, and realized I had become the one she believed in now. That night, as I lay awake listening to her soft snores mingled with her pups' tiny whimpers, I understood something I never thought possible. Love can transcend rejection. Devotion can withstand cruelty. And faith can bloom in the coldest, most desperate places, illuminating everything it touches with a light stronger than any storm. The night the wolves first circled the village, I heard their howls like distant thunder rolling across the fields. I was dozing by the window when a low, unsettling chorus carried on the wind. My chest tightened. I knew those weren't stray dogs. Wolves. I slipped into my boots and crept outside, lantern in hand, every breath a plume of pale fear. I followed the sound to the edge of the woods, where the trees stood like silent sentinels. Through the underbrush, I spotted her silhouette, body tense, hackles up, as she stood between her den and the looming threat. The nearest pup whimpered inside the cloth nest, but she would not back down. I watched her bare her teeth in a silent growl, fur bristling like a warrior's plume. A rustle of leaves and two gray forms emerged, eyes glinting in the lantern's beam. The wolves prowled closer, noses twitching, drawn by the scent of helpless pups. She snarled and stepped forward, body low and rigid. One wolf lunged, hackles raised, but she met it head-on, teeth flashing in the half-light. It was like watching a knight in battle armor, small but fearless, defending her castle. My heart pounded so loudly, I was sure she could hear it. After a frantic standoff, the wolves retreated a few paces, circling back and forth like shadows testing her resolve. She never flinched. Every time they inched closer, she snarled louder, as if she carried within her the collective courage of all mothers. I found myself shouting, "Stay back!" though I knew neither queen of this stand would heed my voice. At dawn, she returned alone to my fence, one ear torn, fur matted with dried blood. My breath skipped a beat at the sight. She limped, body trembling, but her eyes, those dark, unwavering pearls, still burned with fierce pride. I rushed to her side, heart thundering in my ribs, but her gaze held me at bay. She would accept my help on her own terms. Inside, I cleaned her wound as best I could, whispering apologies for the violence she endured. She flinched only once, then settled, trusting me to ease her pain. I pressed a rag soaked in warm water against her flank, and she leaned into my palm, breathing ragged. I felt tears sting my eyes. She looked into my soul, and there was no doubt, only a plea to stand by her side. I thought this battle won. I thought the worst had passed. But nature had another lesson in store for me. Late that evening, I crept back to the den with extra blankets and food. The forest floor was ghostly under a full moon, but when I reached the clearing, the nest was empty. No whimpers, no shivering bodies, only a ragged circle of cloth, stained and flattened. My legs gave way beneath me. The pups were gone. Panic knotted my stomach. My mind raced. The wolves must have taken them. I pictured the small bodies trampled, or worse. I pounded my fist against a tree in helpless rage and grief. The wind whispered through the branches, but offered no answers. I stumbled back toward the village, each step an avalanche of dread. I tore through my house, searching every corner, calling their names like a madman. "Come back!" I pleaded into the night. She appeared at the gate, still limping, head low. I fell to my knees and pressed my face to her side, tears soaking her fur. For a moment, she pressed against me with all her strength, then backed away, stooped low, as if urging me to follow. My chest seized. She was leading me somewhere. I followed her stumbling steps into the dark woods, heart hammering with fresh fear for her too. The moonlight carved silver paths under the trees, and I faltered with every cold gust. She paused by a fallen log and turned, eyes glistening as if revealing a secret. My breath caught. Could she know where her pups were? Then I heard it, faint whimpers from beyond a thicket. I hacked through brambles, shrubs snapping like angry fingers at my skin, until I burst into a hidden hollow. There, huddled beneath a rocky overhang, were her pups, dirty, hungry, but alive. The smallest pup lifted its head and let out a tiny yelp of relief. She sank to her belly, tail thumping the ground in joy, and her body trembled not from fear, but from release. I knelt beside the den, stumbling over my own shock. I flung my arms around her and the pups, hugging them as snowflakes drifted in like blessings. She looked up at me, eyes shining fiercely. It wasn't instinct that brought her here. It was a sacred bond, a guide born of love stronger than any threat. My tears stained the frozen earth as I realized I'd been given a glimpse of something primal, courage that defies size, hope that outlasts danger, and faith that can navigate the darkest woods. She nudged my hand to feed her pups from my pocket, and I did, laughing through sobs. As the wolves' howls faded once more into the distance, I understood that this story wasn't just about survival. It was about the profound wisdom of the wild, teaching me that no darkness is too deep when you carry love as your compass. And in that moment, I knew I would never be the same. That night, I woke to the crunch of paws on gravel and the faintest whimper echoing down the barn aisle. My heart leapt. I thought the worst was behind us, that she'd finally found safety, but I was wrong. I swung the lantern high and saw her silhouette framed by the sagging doorway, her body low, every rib clear beneath her frost-kissed fur, and behind her, 4 tiny shapes stumbling through the straw. She had carried her pups, each one smaller than my hand, across the frozen yard and into my barn, using nothing but her gentle strength and fierce will. My breath caught in my throat as she nudged them toward the loose hay I'd scattered for warmth. I'd never seen anything so humble, so heroic. Tentatively, I set the lantern on a crate and knelt in the sawdust. My fingers shook as I reached out, expecting her to flinch, to snap, to turn away, but she didn't. She let me stroke her head, smoothed the coarse fur between her ears, and for the first time, she leaned into my touch. My palm felt the tremor in her spine, the echo of exhaustion, relief, and trust all at once. She looked at me as though she knew I was already different. I felt tears sting my eyes as the lantern's glow painted her coat in warm amber. Her pups curled around her belly, each one rising for a faint suckle before nesting back into the hay. I whispered her name, though I didn't know it, and she lifted her muzzle, touching my knuckles with her nose. In that contact, I understood something profound. She believed in me as much as I believed in her. If your heart is racing right now, you understand. Subscribe to the channel. Here, we share the truth about animals who feel more deeply than we ever imagined. I backed away to give her space, watching as she settled her pups with a mother's careful pause. The barn was quiet except for their soft whimpers and the distant howl of the wind beyond the wooden walls. I realized I'd been holding my breath, and when I exhaled, I felt lighter, like part of a weight had lifted from my chest. I stood and fetched an old blanket, draping it over her and the pups. She pressed closer to them, shivering despite the extra layer, but her eyes never left mine. I returned with a bowl of warm water and scraps of meat, laying them on a low plank. The pups stirred, and she guided each to the food, gently nudging them one by one. My voice caught in my throat as I watched her instruct them with a quiet authority I'd never attributed to a dog before. As I leaned against the barn door, I reflected on how far we'd come. Not long ago, I would have passed her by without a second thought. Now, I stood here, protector and witness to a miracle made flesh and fur and bone. I felt tears warm on my cheeks, tears I welcomed because they signaled that my heart had grown. Night deepened around us, the barn's single bulb flickering as if in breath with her. When I finally moved to leave, she lifted her head and let out a low sigh, almost a sigh of contentment. Her body relaxed, the tension drained away, and for the first time, I saw peace in her expression. I shut the barn door quietly, lantern swinging by my side. Outside, the wind had died, leaving only a hush that felt respectful, almost reverent. I lingered on the porch, shoulders loose for the first time in days, and thought I'd never felt more alive. But I didn't yet know the full price of that miracle. That morning, I set out into the woods to gather firewood, unaware that the sky was already closing in around me. The first snowflakes were soft and lazy, then suddenly thick and unforgiving, whipping through the trees with a white fury. I pressed on, trusting I knew the route back, but within minutes, every landmark I recognized vanished beneath the swirling drifts. The pines became specters. The trail dissolved into a silent wasteland. Panic fluttered in my chest like a trapped bird. My boots sank ankle-deep in powder, each step more exhausting than the last. The barn, our refuge, lay somewhere behind me, but I had no sense of direction. My lantern's flame danced in the gusts, flickering out, and leaving me in a world of gray and black. I shouted her name, my voice swallowed by the storm. Memories of her bravery swelled in my mind, the nests she'd built, the pups she'd saved. I felt a fierce urgency to return, but the woods closed in like prison walls. My heart pounded so loud I thought she might hear it. I staggered off the trail, seeking any hint of familiarity, but the wind shredded each sound before it could reach my ears. Then, as I rounded a snow-drifted stump, my lantern popped and died. Darkness crashed in, and I slid to my knees, chest heaving. I thought, this is it, lost forever in nature's unforgiving cage. My fingers grew numb, and tears froze on my cheeks. I closed my eyes, bracing for despair. A bark sliced through the storm, sharp, insistent, impossibly close. My pulse soared. She was here. "Bella?" I croaked into the wind. The bark came again, a signal cutting through the white noise. I scrambled to my feet, calling as I stumbled forward. For a moment, I was blinded by the gale. Then a dark shape appeared in the swirling snow, a silhouette I knew better than any map. She pressed forward, pausing to look back, ensuring I followed. In that instant, awe washed over me. How did she find me? How did she know where to guide me? I reached out blindly and felt her warm flank against my glove. Her tail thumped once, twice, steadying me. I wrapped an arm around her neck, clinging to her as if she were a lifeline. Each step she took forged a path through the blizzard, her paws carving a trench for me to follow. She led me like a mother guiding a blind man, every cautious step, every pause to check the way, filled with unwavering care. Her breath steamed in the frigid air, and I leaned into her warmth, willing my frost-bitten fingers to circulate again. The storm battered us, but she never broke her stride. I closed my eyes, imagining a world beyond the fury, our barn's hearth, the soft whine of her pups, the promise of safety she carried on her shoulders. I prayed I could keep up. After what felt like hours, the trees thinned, and the air stilled. A faint glow appeared ahead. The lantern I'd left hanging by the barn door. Relief flooded me so completely it made me weep. The barn door's warm light beckoned through the flake-laden night. She paused at the threshold and looked back, meeting my gaze. Her eyes shone with something I can only describe as quiet triumph. I let slip a sob of gratitude, reaching down to hug her thick neck as snow drifted at our feet. She watched me for a heartbeat, then turned and stepped inside, shaking off the worst of the storm. I followed, slamming the door against the howl of the wind and dropping to my knees in the straw, exhausted and exhilarated. She nuzzled my face, sending her warm breath across my frozen cheeks. In the glow of the oil lamp, I brushed the snow from her shoulders and murmured, "I thought I'd never see you again." She woo-fed softly, then lay down beside me, her body curled protectively around my calves, as if to say, "I told you I'd never abandon you." That night, as I lit a fresh fire, I held her close, feeling her steady heartbeat against my side. I thought back on every desperate moment, the swirling storm, the pitch-black forest, my own fear, and I realized that in the darkest hour, when all hope seemed lost, she became my guide, my guardian, my way home. I whispered a promise into her fur. "I'll always follow you, just as you've followed me." And in her soft sigh, I heard the echo of a bond forged in snow and peril, a bond I would carry long after the storm passed. 2 days later, the forest felt haunted. I returned to the clearing at dawn, heart heavy with a mix of dread and hope. The snow lay undisturbed in a perfect white sheet, as if the world had held its breath. I called her name softly, "Bella?" But only the wind answered, whispering through the bare branches. I found them huddled in the shallow hollow where she'd borne them, 4 tiny bodies pressed against her side. My breath hitched, my boots crunched as I knelt. Her fur was matted with ice, eyes closed in peaceful repose. Her body was still warm, but I knew she was gone. I reached out with trembling fingers and brushed the snow from her muzzle. I wanted to believe she slept, waiting for morning, but the chill in her bones told me the truth. She'd given everything to shield her pups from the merciless cold. Tears welled so quickly I could not look away. I curled beside her, half afraid to break the fragile scene. My cheek rested against her flank. I could still feel the faint flutter of her heart's last rhythm echoing in my own chest. My sobs caught in my throat as I pressed my forehead to her spine, and the world narrowed to the sound of my grieving. "I thought we made it," I whispered, voice cracking. "I thought you'd survive for them, for me." Her litter stirred at the edges, small snuffles echoing like desperate prayers. One pup lifted its head, blinking large eyes at the pale sky. I reached out a hand, and it crawled toward me, guided by instinct. It nuzzled my palm, then looked up at the lifeless form beside it. My tears blurred the world as I realized what she'd done. She had lain down in the snow, her body a shield of warmth around those fragile lives, refusing to move until the last heartbeat escaped her. She traded her own survival for theirs, an act of devotion too immense for words. I sat back on my heels, chest tightening. I remembered how she'd carried them here, one by one, through storms and threats. I remembered how she'd taught me compassion, hope, faith, and now she lay still, a martyr to a bond only a mother could know. A chill gust swept across the clearing, lifting flurries of snow. I gathered her pups in my arms, pressing them to my chest. They trembled, tiny lives shivering against the cold edge of mortality. I wrapped them in my scarf and stood, heart pounding so fiercely I feared it would burst free. I lifted her head gently and spoke to the silent forest, to the cruel neighbor's empty door, to everything and nothing. She forgave them all, even those who didn't deserve it. Forgave them, and she left. A strangled sob tore from my throat. I sank to my knees, cradling her pups like sacred relics. The sun rose weakly over the trees, painting the snow in pale gold. In that quiet light, I could almost see her reach out one last time, guiding them into a future she would never know. I found myself whispering apologies into the still air. Sorry I couldn't save you. Sorry I couldn't stop the cold. Sorry I didn't understand sooner. But forgiveness, I realized, was her gift to the world, her final lesson. She'd shown me how to love beyond fear, how to believe when all seemed lost. Behind me, a soft rustle made me look up. One pup, the smallest of the litter, had wriggled free from my scarf and now stood at my feet. It tilted its head and met my gaze with those deep, knowing eyes. My chest constricted. It was the same look I'd seen in her eyes so many times. A plea to believe, a promise that life endures. I knelt and held out my hand. The pup stepped forward, pressing its warm nose against my palm. A shiver ran through me, not from the cold, but from awe. In that moment, I felt her presence, her spirit alive in this fragile creature who had refused to stay hidden. I scooped it up, cradling it against my heart as the other pups stirred in the scarf. The smallest one nestled against me, and I whispered into its fur, "You are her miracle." My tears fell freely now, but they felt like release, like baptism into a world made larger by her sacrifice. I tucked the pups into my coat and made my way back through the trees, every step a vow. I would give them life and love, everything she couldn't, and I would tell her story to anyone who would listen, so the world would know what true devotion looks like. As I emerged into the clearing by my barn, I paused and looked back at the spot where she lay. A single ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the snow with a soft glow, as if blessing her rest. I whispered, "Goodbye, brave heart," before turning to the future she had secured. I understood then that her legacy was not grief, but hope. She had forgiven cruelty with kindness, battered the storm with courage, and showed me that love can transcend even death. If your heart is full of awe right now, write, "Nature is wiser than us." If you too believe that animals remember kindness, right, we are not alone in this world. A wolf pup bit into my pant leg and wouldn't let go, and in the next hour that little wild creature would drag me straight from the edge of death into a moment I still can't explain. What he led me to changed everything I thought I knew about animals and about myself. When I felt something clamp down on my pant leg, my breath caught in my throat because I knew this wasn't an accident. It was just after sunrise. The forest was still wet with dew, and the air had that crisp, earthy smell only a September morning can carry. I had been walking the same narrow path I'd taken for years, basket in hand, scanning the moss for chanterelles and porcini. Every sound was familiar, the snap of a twig under my boot, the distant tapping of a woodpecker, the rustle of a squirrel in the leaves. This was my place, my quiet place. That's when it happened. A sudden, violent tug from below, so strong I nearly lost my balance. My heart lurched. I looked down, expecting maybe a stray dog or someone's lost hunting pup, but what I saw made my mind go blank for a second. It was no dog. Standing there, legs trembling, fur matted and thin, was a wolf pup, gray as ash, eyes wide and unblinking. His muzzle was pressed against my leg, teeth locked into the fabric of my pants. Instinct hit me like a punch. Wild animals don't do this. They bolt. They vanish before you even notice them. But this one, he wasn't letting go. "Hey, easy now," I muttered, trying to shake my leg gently free. The pup growled, not the deep, threatening growl of an adult wolf, but a low, almost desperate vibration. Then, just as quickly, he released me, sprang back a few feet, and, God help me, lunged again, grabbing the same spot on my leg, pulling even harder. It wasn't an attack. I could feel it. There was no rage in him, no snapping, no tearing at the skin. It was forceful, yes, but it was urgent. He pulled, stopped, glanced up at me, then yanked again. I stood there frozen for a moment, my mind spinning through every possibility. Maybe he was rabid? No? His eyes were clear? Maybe he'd lost his mother and thought I was some kind of savior? Maybe he was starving and confused? But there was something else. Something in the way he looked at me. Head slightly tilted, ears twitching, eyes fixed, like he needed me to follow. "Where's your mom, kid?" I asked out loud, feeling ridiculous. He didn't answer, of course. Instead, he let go again, darted forward a few paces down the narrow deer trail, then spun around, staring at me, tail stiff. The message couldn't have been clearer if he'd spoken English. "Come with me." I took one cautious step forward. He retreated a step of his own, eyes never leaving mine. Another step from me, another retreat from him. And so it went, this strange, silent negotiation between two creatures who had no business understanding each other. The forest felt different now. The usual peace had been replaced by something electric, something tight in my chest. I was following a wolf pup, for God's sake. Every nerve in my body was telling me this was wrong, dangerous. But my feet kept moving. The pup stopped again, came back to me, and grabbed my pant leg once more, this time pulling to the right, off the faint trail. The ground was softer there, uneven, scattered with roots and fallen branches. I had to watch my step, but he tugged without pause, glancing back every few seconds to make sure I was still behind him. That's when it hit me. He wasn't afraid of me, not in the slightest. In fact, it felt like I was the one being led, guided. This was no random encounter, no lost animal stumbling into my path. I don't know how long we moved like that, him pulling, me stumbling after, but I remember my mind starting to ease, thinking maybe this was nothing more than some weird fluke. Maybe the pup was just lonely or lost, and I'd walk with him for a bit, then turn back to my basket of mushrooms. I even let myself laugh under my breath at the absurdity of it. That's when a shiver crawled down my spine, because deep in my gut, I knew I was lying to myself. I thought he was just playing, or scared, or simply confused. I thought this little detour would end in a harmless story to tell back home over coffee. But nature was about to show me something else entirely, something I would never forget. The pup let go again, darted forward a few yards, then stopped, ears twitching, head turning just enough to make sure I was watching. And when I didn't move quickly enough, he came back, this time not so forcefully, and clamped down on my pant leg again. Not a bite to hurt, just enough to pull. It was the strangest sensation, being urged forward by an animal that should have been running from me. Every instinct told me to be careful. Where there's a pup, there's a mother. And if she was close, hiding in the brush, she wouldn't take kindly to finding a 60-year-old man trailing after her young. Still, something in that little creature's determination overpowered my hesitation. I decided to follow, but kept my senses sharp, eyes scanning the shadows, ears tuned to the slightest crack of a branch. We moved deeper into the forest, past places I knew well, the old cedar stump shaped like a chair, the patch of moss where I always found chanterelles. Then, beyond the familiar, into a part of the woods I had never walked. The ground here was less forgiving, littered with fallen logs and slick roots hidden under ferns. The pup didn't trot in a straight line. He moved in bursts, a few quick steps forward, then a pause to glance back at me. Sometimes he'd take 2 hesitant steps toward me before resuming his route, as if checking to see if I was still coming. That got to me. It was the same way a child might keep looking over their shoulder to make sure a parent was following. There was no fear in those glances, only a kind of recognition. He looked at me like I was one of his own, like we'd met before in another life. And I swear, in those moments when our eyes locked, I felt a quiet understanding pass between us. I didn't know what he wanted to show me, or why he'd chosen me, but I could feel that it mattered, to him, and somehow to me. We wove through a tangle of alder and spruce, the sunlight thinning overhead, until the world was mostly shadows and filtered green. Every few yards, he'd stop, sniff the air, and check that I was still behind him. If I slowed too much, he'd circle back, nudge my boot, or tug lightly at my pants before hurrying ahead again. It wasn't random. There was a direction, a purpose to every turn. I kept my distance just enough to give him space, but close enough not to lose him if he bolted. And all the while I kept glancing into the undergrowth, half expecting a pair of golden eyes to appear, the mother wolf, ready to defend her pup. Minutes stretched into what felt like half an hour. My breathing grew heavier, the forest floor damp and soft beneath my boots, but the pup pressed on without pause. At one point, he stopped entirely. His body went still, head high, nose working the air. Then he turned to me again, and in that brief second, I saw it. A flash of something deeper than instinct. Almost relief, as if he was saying, "Good, you're still here." It's a strange thing, being led by an animal like that. You start to forget which of you is supposed to be the guide. I wasn't thinking about my mushroom basket anymore. I wasn't even thinking about time. My whole focus narrowed to that small gray body in front of me, slipping between the ferns, pausing just enough for me to catch up. A few times I told myself, this is madness. Turn back, but my feet wouldn't listen. Eventually, the trees thinned slightly, and a pale beam of sunlight broke through, falling across what looked like a small clearing ahead. The pup slowed, as though we were approaching some final destination, and I thought, this must be it. His den. I'm about to meet the rest of his family. The idea brought a strange mix of anticipation and unease. Maybe he needed help. Maybe the others were injured or trapped. Or maybe I'd just walked into a situation I'd regret for the rest of my life. I took another step, my boots crunching softly in the undergrowth, the light growing stronger on my face. I thought we were just walking to his den, but this was only the beginning. The trees began to open up, and soon we stepped into a small clearing no wider than a backyard. A fallen tree lay across the middle, its bark stripped away on one side, revealing pale, weathered wood. Moss clung to it in thick patches, and a few mushrooms had claimed the shaded side as their own. The pup stopped just before the tree, his body lowering slightly, tail stiff. He didn't grab my pant leg this time. Instead, he glanced back at me, then padded toward the log with a deliberate slowness, as though crossing some invisible threshold. I followed cautiously, my eyes scanning the edges of the clearing. A place like this could easily hide a den, a hollow beneath the roots, or a burrow tucked under the moss. Part of me expected to see movement in the shadows, other pups, or maybe an adult wolf, watching. My mind began forming its own explanation. This is it. He's brought me to his family. Maybe they're trapped somehow, or maybe he's just trying to get me close enough for them to smell me. Another part of me, more cynical, thought, or maybe he's been leading me in circles for no reason at all. The pup hopped onto the log, his small paws gripping the slick moss, and stood there for a moment, scanning the perimeter. Then he froze, completely still, ears perked, nose lifted to the breeze. Something had changed. I stopped where I was, my breath quiet. His whole posture was locked in focus. His eyes weren't on me anymore. They were fixed on something just beyond the clearing. The air felt different, denser somehow. Even the faint sounds of the forest seemed to hush. The pup didn't move. No tugging, no pacing, no beckoning. Just that rigid stillness, like a statue carved from ash and fur. His gaze was locked on the far side, where a wall of dense shrubs formed a dark, tangled barrier. I waited. Nothing. No sound. No movement. Minutes seemed to stretch. I shifted my weight, feeling a prickle of awkwardness. Maybe this was where the trail ended. Maybe he'd led me here for nothing more than a resting spot. And that's when the spell started to break. I glanced back toward the way we'd come, thinking about the basket of mushrooms I'd abandoned somewhere back there, the long walk home, the coffee cooling in my thermos. A strange mixture of relief and disappointment crept in. It occurred to me that maybe I'd been projecting too much onto this whole thing, the urgency in his pulling, the way he kept looking back. Maybe he wasn't guiding me to anything remarkable at all. Maybe he was just lost. The idea was oddly deflating. I let out a slow breath, glanced once more at the pup, still staring into the brush, and began to shift my feet, ready to turn around. "I guess you just wandered too far from home, huh?" I murmured. My voice sounded too loud in the quiet, and that's when it happened. The stillness shattered. In the next heartbeat, everything changed. The quiet broke with a sound that made every muscle in my body tense. From deep inside the wall of shrubs came a dull, heavy cracking, not the quick snap of a twig under a squirrel's foot, but the slow, deliberate splintering of something thick, wood giving way under weight. I froze. That was no bird, no rabbit. The sound came again, louder this time. A heavy shift followed by the wet thud of something pressing into the ground. My mind started racing through possibilities, and none of them were good. Boar? Maybe. I'd seen what those tusks could do to a tree, let alone a man. Bear? Worse. Out here, far from any help, you don't get second chances with a bear. I felt my pulse in my ears. The pup's head snapped toward me. For the first time since I'd met him, his composure cracked, his ears pinned back, his tail lowered, his paws shifted in quick, restless steps as though caught between fight and flight. Then, without warning, he sprang down from the log, rushed to my side, and clamped onto my pant leg again. Hard, not playful, not insistent in that guiding way from before. This was different, urgent. He yanked, hard enough to nearly pull me off balance, dragging me at an angle away from the clearing. "Hey, easy, easy," I hissed, but I followed. The sounds behind us were getting louder, more chaotic, branches snapping, the low scrape of something massive pushing through the undergrowth. The pup didn't look back. He didn't need to. Every fiber of him was bent toward one goal: getting me out of there. We cut through a narrow break between two thick pines, the ground sloping slightly downhill. My boots slipped on damp moss, but he kept pulling, darting just far enough ahead that I had to quicken my steps to keep him in reach. Something primal was building in my chest, not just fear, but the strange, dizzying clarity that comes when you realize you're prey. The sounds in the clearing shifted. A deep, guttural huff rolled through the trees, followed by another splintering crack. The kind of sound you feel in your ribs. I didn't need to see it to know. It was big. Big enough that the forest moved around it. The pup led me down a shallow gully, through ferns that slapped against my legs, then up the other side toward thicker cover. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare slow down, and then, just for a heartbeat, he stopped. Right there on the crest of the gully, he turned to me, his chest heaving, his eyes locked onto mine, wide and unblinking. There was something in them that stripped me bare. It wasn't fear, it wasn't panic, it was pleading, and in that raw, silent moment, my throat tightened so fast it hurt. I don't cry easily, not for movies, not for bad news, but right then, in the middle of that wild, wet forest, with danger closing in, I felt hot tears sting my eyes. In his eyes was a plea so deep, I nearly broke apart right there. He gave one quick tug, almost gentle this time, and I understood. Move. We plunged deeper into the trees, the sounds behind us growing fainter with every step. My breathing was ragged, my legs aching, but I didn't let go of the urgency he'd given me. Somewhere, maybe 20 or 30 yards back, something heavy crashed into the clearing we'd just left. A final snap, a low grunt, and then silence. I didn't look back. We were still moving fast, the forest whipping past in a blur of greens and browns, when a sound rolled through the trees that made every nerve in my body seize. A deep, guttural rumble, not close enough to feel in my chest, but close enough to know it was meant for me. It was followed by the thud of something massive hitting the ground, then another, and another. Heavy, deliberate steps. The pup jerked on my pant leg again, harder this time, almost tripping me. I stumbled forward, trying to keep my footing, but curiosity and fear made me glance over my shoulder. That's when I saw it. Through a thin screen of saplings, stepping into the clearing we'd just left, came the dark, hulking shape of a bear. Not lumbering, not curious, moving with purpose. The morning light caught on its fur, a thick, matted brown. Even from here, I could see the size of its head, the swell of its shoulders. It stopped for a moment, sniffing the air, head swinging slowly from side to side. It was looking for us. My stomach turned to ice. In that instant, the truth hit me like a hammer. If I'd stayed in that clearing for even one more minute, maybe less, I wouldn't be standing here at all. The pup didn't let me linger in the thought. He yanked again, pulling me off the slope and into a patch of dense undergrowth. The ferns slapped at my face and arms, but I followed, ducking low to avoid the tangled branches above. The sounds behind us grew sharper, the crunch of deadfall under enormous weight, the dull scrape of claws against wood. I could picture the bear pushing through the shrubs, that massive body gliding where mine would thrash and stumble. The pup never looked back. He kept his head low, tail stiff, ears pinned tight against his skull. Every few steps, he'd give another sharp tug, as if reminding me there was no room for hesitation. We broke through a thicket and into a narrow game trail that sloped downward. My boots slid in the damp dirt, nearly pitching me forward. Somewhere ahead, I heard the faint trickle of water, a stream maybe, and then saw the dark cut of a ravine opening in the forest floor. The pup darted toward it without slowing, weaving between rocks and roots with the ease of something born here. I struggled to match his pace, my legs burning, my breath loud in my own ears. Behind us, the bear let out another sound. Deeper this time, a sound I felt in my spine. It wasn't a roar, but a low, vibrating moan that seemed to say, "I know where you are." My chest tightened, my vision narrowing as we reached the edge of the ravine. The drop wasn't sheer, but steep enough that going down without care could mean a twisted ankle or worse. The pup didn't hesitate. He scrambled down the incline, paws finding sure purchase on jutting rocks and thick roots. I followed as best I could, sliding part of the way, grabbing at anything that would hold my weight. The air here was cooler, damp with the scent of wet soil and stone. Only when we reached the bottom did I realize how far we'd come from that first clearing. The forest above was just a jagged rim of green and shadow. Down here, the world felt sealed off, hidden. The pup finally released my pant leg and stepped ahead a few paces, panting lightly, ears flicking at some sound I couldn't yet hear. He didn't seem relieved, just focused, as if there was still something I needed to see. I stood there, chest heaving, trying to make sense of it all. The image of the bear stepping into that clearing wouldn't leave my mind. The weight of the truth pressed hard against me. That little wolf had pulled me away from death, and yet, as he turned to face me again, eyes bright and unblinking, I felt it. This wasn't over. The tension in his small frame wasn't fading. I thought he'd just saved me from the bear. But it turned out that was only the first step. The pup moved ahead of me now, weaving through the bottom of the ravine with a new urgency. His paws splashed lightly through a shallow stream that curled along the rocky floor, his head swinging side to side as if tracking something I couldn't hear. Then I heard it, faint at first, almost lost under the sound of running water. A high, thin squeak, not the chirp of a bird, not the chatter of a squirrel. This was sharper, more desperate, a cry. We followed the sound deeper along the ravine until it grew clearer, more insistent. The pup broke into a trot, rounding a bend where the water pooled in a muddy hollow, and there, caught between a tangle of half-submerged branches, was another wolf pup. This one was smaller, his fur soaked and plastered against his thin frame. His hind leg was twisted awkwardly between two thick roots, his front paws scraping at the mud as he tried to pull himself free. Each movement drew another thin, pitiful cry. I froze, understanding hitting me like a jolt to the chest. The pup who'd found me, who had dragged me through the forest, pulled me away from a bear, hadn't just been running from danger. He'd been leading me to this, to him, not for food, not for safety, for help. I didn't waste time thinking about it. I waded into the cold water, the mud sucking at my boots. The trapped pup flinched when I reached for him, baring tiny teeth in a weak show of fear, but the other pup was suddenly there beside me, pressing close to his sibling's head, letting out a low, soothing whimper. "It's okay," I murmured, as much to myself as to them. My hands worked quickly, feeling along the roots until I found where the smallest gap was. The wood was slick with moss, the mud packed tight around it. I braced my foot against one root and pulled. The trapped pup yelped, the sound cutting through me, but then, with a sudden wet pop, his leg came free. He tumbled forward into the shallow water, scrambling upright almost immediately. The first pup was on him in an instant, nose pressed to his wet fur, sniffing and nuzzling as if to check every inch for injury. The smaller one leaned into him, their bodies touching, both of them trembling. I stood there in the cold stream, hands dripping, my heart thundering in my chest. I didn't know if wolves could understand gratitude the way we do, but what I saw in that moment, it changed something in me. The animal had shown me something that altered my whole life. This wasn't instinct alone. This wasn't a random act of survival. The little wolf had sought me out, a human, and asked, in the only way he could, for help. He had trusted me enough to lead me right to the heart of his world. The smaller pup shook himself, sending a spray of water into the air, then leaned his head briefly against my shin before darting back toward his sibling. The contact was so quick I almost convinced myself I imagined it. Almost. The first pup looked up at me then. Just looked. No tugging, no pulling, no urging. His eyes were bright, alert, and for the first time since I'd met him, calm. It was as if a weight had lifted from both of us. I stepped back to the bank, my boots heavy with water, watching them huddle together in the shallows. The forest around us was silent again, the danger behind us, replaced by something far more difficult to process, the quiet enormity of what had just happened. Two small lives, one leading me through danger to save the other, and me, the unlikely piece in their wild, impossible puzzle. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if their mother was near or if I'd ever see them again. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I'd never walk into these woods the same way again. For a while, none of us moved. The two pups stayed close to each other in the shallows, their fur dripping, their thin bodies pressed so tightly together it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. The smaller one trembled with the aftershock of being trapped, but the bigger one, my guide, stayed steady, his eyes flicking from me to his sibling, as if silently confirming we were all still here. I expected them to bolt the moment they found their legs, to vanish into the shadows like the wild creatures they were. That's what animals do. They run. But they didn't. Instead, they lingered. The smaller pup was the first to move toward me, stepping hesitantly through the shallow water until he reached the bank. I stayed perfectly still, afraid that the smallest motion would send him darting away. He stopped at my boots. For a second, he just stared at me, head tilted, ears twitching, and then, in a gesture so quiet and simple, it rooted me to the spot. He lowered his head and rested his muzzle on the toe of my boot. It lasted only a moment, maybe two, but in that moment, the pounding of my heart was all I could hear. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something else entirely. Acknowledgement, connection, as if he knew, as if he understood that I'd reached into that cold water for him, pulled him free, and that without me, this day might have ended very differently. I swallowed hard, not trusting my voice. My hands, still wet and cold, trembled at my sides. The bigger pup came up behind him then, brushing his side against his brother's before stepping forward himself. He didn't touch me. He didn't need to. His gaze held me there, solid and unblinking, like a final wordless thank you before the world pulled us apart again. Then, with a sharp shake of his head, he turned. The smaller pup followed, their paws splashing softly through the water before they climbed up the far side of the ravine. I watched them go, their small bodies weaving between the roots and ferns. Twice they looked back, once halfway up, and again just before the crest, eyes catching the light in a way I'll never forget. And then they were gone, swallowed by the green. I stayed where I was, boots heavy with mud and water, my breath still uneven. My heart was hammering against my ribs, not from running, but from the enormity of what had just passed between us. My palms tingled, my legs felt unsteady, as if they didn't quite belong to me anymore. It wasn't just the danger, or the bear, or even the rescue. It was the exchange, the invisible thread that had been strung between us from the moment the first pup clamped his teeth into my pant leg. I stood there for I don't know how long, the forest returning slowly to its usual rhythm around me, the soft trickle of the stream, the distant call of a jay, the whisper of leaves stirred by a breeze. Eventually, I exhaled, a long, shaky breath that felt like it carried the weight of the entire morning with it. I thought that was the end. I thought they'd disappear into the vastness of the woods, their lives continuing on whatever wild path they were meant to walk. I thought I'd never see them again. But fate had other plans. Weeks passed before I found myself back in that part of the forest. It wasn't that I'd avoided it, at least not consciously, but every time I thought about returning, something inside me hesitated. The memory of that morning still lived under my skin. The bear, the cold water, the two pups pressed together in the shallows. It felt almost wrong to go back, as if I'd been granted a moment I wasn't meant to trespass on again. But one crisp afternoon, the pull was too strong to ignore. The air was cool enough to bite at my cheeks, the forest floor scattered with early fallen leaves. My basket swung loosely at my side, more an excuse to be out here than a real plan to fill it. The trail was quiet. I moved slowly, following the turns I'd memorized without meaning to. The leaning cedar, the patch of moss shaped like a map of some forgotten country, the gap between two spruce trunks that opened into the gully. When I reached the rise just before the clearing, I stopped. My breath was steady, but my heart had started to thump in that deep, deliberate way it does before you step into something unknown. And then I saw him. On the far edge of the clearing, where the sunlight spilled like liquid gold through the trees, stood a wolf. Not a pup, not a shadow glimpsed between branches. A full-grown wolf, tall and lean, his coat a blend of ash and silver, every line of him sharp with strength. He wasn't moving. He wasn't prowling or posturing. He just stood there, his head high, his eyes locked on me. I froze. Every instinct told me to lower my gaze, to back away slowly, but I couldn't. There was no threat in his stance, no stiffness in his shoulders, no baring of teeth, only recognition. It hit me all at once, not in my head, but in my chest, like a memory I didn't know I had. He looked at me as if I was one of his own. We stayed like that for what could have been seconds or minutes, neither of us moving. I could hear my own breath, the faint rustle of leaves high above us, the almost silent hum of the forest breathing around us. I didn't know if he was the father or the mother of those pups. I didn't know if wolves could remember faces the way we do, or if I was just a figure tied to the scent of that day. But in that steady, unblinking gaze, I felt the same invisible thread I'd felt with the pup, the sense of something understood without being spoken. At last, he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head, casting one last glance over his shoulder before stepping into the shadows of the trees. His movements were unhurried, almost ceremonial, as though the leaving was just as important as the standing. I stayed rooted to the spot long after he was gone. The light in the clearing dimmed as the sun shifted, and still I didn't move. My mind replayed that silent meeting over and over, the calm in his eyes, the quiet certainty in his posture. Whatever had passed between us that day, I knew it wasn't chance. And it wasn't over. I didn't move for a long time after the wolf disappeared into the trees. The forest closed in around me again. The rustle of the leaves high above, the distant tapping of a woodpecker, the faint stir of wind threading between trunks. But everything felt different. The air, the light, the ground under my boots, or maybe it was me. Because in that moment, standing alone at the edge of that clearing, I realized that what had happened weeks ago wasn't just some wild encounter to tell over coffee. It wasn't an odd memory to tuck away and pull out at family gatherings. It had changed me. That day with the pups, with the bear, with the cold water clinging to my boots. It had rewritten something in me so quietly I didn't notice until now. I had seen the wild not as something to fear or conquer or keep at a distance, but as something capable of thought, choice, and, God help me, kindness. The image of the adult wolf's eyes burned in my mind. They weren't the eyes of a predator sizing up prey. They weren't the wary, watchful eyes of a creature weighing fight or flight. They were steady, knowing. In them, I saw more than one thing: gratitude for pulling his pup's brother from that tangle of roots. Trust, the kind you don't get by accident, not from a wild animal, and something else. A warning maybe, a reminder that the line between life and death in the wild is razor thin, and that day, we'd both walked it. The pieces slid into place with a kind of quiet inevitability. The pup had saved my life. He'd dragged me out of the clearing just ahead of the bear, not running for himself, but pulling me along with him. Without that, my story might have ended there among the moss and the broken branches, and I had saved his brother, pulled him from the trap of those roots before the cold or the water or the bear finished the job. It was an exchange, not one you could plan, not one you could explain away as chance. Life for life. The kind of trade that carves itself into you, whether you want it to or not. I walked a little further into the clearing, my steps slow, my eyes searching the shadows where the wolf had stood. It was empty now, but I could still feel the weight of that gaze on me, as if some part of him was still here, watching from beyond the trees. The truth was, I didn't know if I'd ever see them again. The pups, the adult wolf, any of them. Maybe this was the last time our paths would cross, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that it had happened at all. And as I stood there, the hum of the forest wrapping around me, I felt something unexpected press in, a kind of humility I hadn't known in years, the knowledge that there are forces, bonds, and understandings in this world that don't require words, and that I had been part of one. I let out a long breath, my legs suddenly heavy. The tension of weeks seemed to drain all at once, leaving me almost hollow. I crossed to a nearby stump, its surface smoothed by years of weather, and sat down slowly. For a long while, I just listened. To the creek murmuring somewhere in the ravine, to the breeze stirring the last few green leaves above me. My hands rested loosely on my knees, and I found myself shaking my head, not in disbelief exactly, but in that strange, weightless place where disbelief and awe meet. Finally, I whispered it out loud, the words catching in my throat as if they didn't want to leave. This doesn't happen, but I saw it myself. I sat there until the light began to fade, letting the forest keep the rest of the story. Because some things aren't meant to be explained, only carried. And this was one of them. If you believe in a special connection with animals, right, we are not alone in this world.